Pete Robertson, Chief Executive of Food and Drink Federation Cymru. And he's going to talk to us about reset or redefine as the Welsh food and drink industry navigates its recovery, and how do supply chains need to adapt to thrive in the future. Now then, as Pete makes his way to the stage, Pete, welcome. I'm just going to give you all some biographical notes, which Pete has 25 years of manufacturing experience across Wales in a whole host of products, from meat processing, hair care, automotive, and breakfast cereals and bars. I think probably quite pertinent title in terms of adaptation, Pete, because you joined for Food and Drink Federation, FDF as we call it, at the start of COVID, or near the start of COVID. So your story is also one of adaptation personally, and indeed the supply chain. So we look forward to your presentation, and we'll take some questions at the end of the session. Can you please welcome Pete?
First of all, I would just like to say thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you. As been said, I've been in the Food and Drink Federation since April 2020. This is actually only the second time I've been out of the house, give or take. And it's a real pleasure to come and have the opportunity to speak to you. Meet some people that I've already been dealing with, and hopefully meet some new people. The other thing, just to say very quickly, is it's always good to learn, and already in the first hour, I think it's been really fascinating discussion. It's really interesting. I'll touch on some things, but Wales is the #1 sustainable farming sector in the world. I'll be honest with you, I did not know that. And one of the things that I'm very keen to do and make sure we do is make sure there's a collective, but I'll come on to that in a second. Very quickly, Food and Drink Federation, I won't bore you, we're a trade association across the UK representing predominantly manufacturers of very different sectors. So whether it's different types of processing, manufacturers, large, small, right across the UK. So we're that type of organisation. In terms of what we're looking to do, we're a members organisation, so we're there to support our members and give them the opportunity to thrive. When I started in April, FDF had been present in Wales, but not necessarily really present in Wales, had not really committed to Wales. And one of the things I was really passionate about making that happen. In my journey that Gwyn talked about, I've actually been a customer services manager for 2,500 hairdressers. Trust me, that's a tough crowd. But what that means is that my first perspective is customer care for our members, whether it's businesses across the UK that have manufacturing facilities in Wales, or whether it's headquartered businesses in Wales. It's really important to me. Clearly, what we want to do is, it says advocate on there, we want to engage with the policy agenda, we want to make sure that we're doing things that are practically to realise very much the potential. I'll talk a lot about technology. I'm a huge fan of technology. Not the greatest user, truth be told, but fundamentally, I think it's a fundamental part of our future moving forward. And one of the key things as well, and I think you've talked to Catherine as well, is about this working together, partnerships. I mean, one of the first things I was delighted to do was to try and bring together members of the various different communities to bring a Welsh perspective, writing to people like Boris Johnson to try and help them understand the challenges we have. And I think genuinely, collectively, across the whole supply chain, it's really going to make a difference. Okay, the one thing to recognise is what I've tried to do, because the brief was supply chain, is to look at it in two directions. The first direction is what can we see for food and drink manufacturers, which I'll come on to now. And then the next direction is what is the overall food and drink supply chain? What are the challenges? What does that look like? What's the landscape? So we've already mentioned, Bruce, you've already mentioned the skills shortages, and you're absolutely right. The newspapers say lorry drivers, the reality says everywhere. In terms of, and it's not just about, that's just, to put it crudely, that's just people. We're not even talking about skills shortages. We're talking about, I mean, the food and drink sector in Wales has quite a heavy reliance on what you would call temporary staff to deal with flexibility, to deal with changes in capacity. And even if those positions you come in, you can train someone in the day, the reality is if you can't even get those people to come in, it makes it very difficult to have a stable manufacturing process. Ingredients, you guys will know, the ingredients, inflation, ingredient prices are going up, labour costs are going up because of competition, and then obviously the gas prices, I mean, apparently now they're only triple what they were before, and that's apparently a celebration. One of the things in our sector then, we talk about plastic, which again, clearly is very, very pertinent to effectively your customers. The processors, the meat processors, the plastic. If you think of let's take a ready meal plastic container, for example, there's 7 different types of plastic in that, and it has to do a huge amount. It has to be frozen, has to be heated, has to keep the food safe for 12 months. There's lots of things in there. And as a sector, that's one particular part. In terms of recycling, effective producer responsibility, yes, something has to be done, but that's a 2.7 billion annual cost to the UK coming down the track. And as a sector, we've got to try and manage that. Global trade, EU and global trade, I think we've talked about that already. I think you all know the story there. The next thing I put up is about net zero. It's interesting. The narrative is net zero of 2050, unless you're China, it's 2060, unless you're India, it's 2070. However, as a sector, in common with BRC, NFU and others, we're actually just recently publishing our target, which is actually 2040. And I think all of us in this room realise that, okay, those dates are particular dates, but the reality is we're here now, it's now. You know, we're in it, this is it, we have to crack on. And then finally, food nutrition, whether it's labelling. I mean, it was interesting, you mentioned the term, and the term is always going to get hackles on my, to be honest with you, is when we talk about ultra-processed food. You know, how do you think it gets made? A process can be walking to and from something. That, to me, and it's interesting because it's similar to the same narrative that we've talked about, which is quite often, if you look across a lot of the landscape, the narrative around food and drink is rarely positive. It tends to be talking about what it can't do or what it doesn't do, rather than talking about what it can do and how it does help and how it does help you thrive. And I think that's one of the things that we've tried to do, that piece at the end there on the slide, is around fibre and the benefits of fibre in food. And we're trying to get onto that front foot. I think as a sector and as an industry, we've spent too long in the defensive. We've spent too long trying to justify why we're here. One small statistic for you, food and drink is the largest manufacturing employer in the whole country. If you add aerospace and you add automotive, we're still more than double the size of those sectors. Yet that's not necessarily something that's understood. So there is a huge, to go to the question earlier about how do we showcase food and drink, there is a challenge for the entire industry and the entire sector to try and meet there for sure. So looking at supply chain, in a more holistic perspective, you know, I'm talking there about the manufacturing side of things, but then you start to look on the retailers. They've also got labour shortages. They've also got a significant issue for them, looking at it from their, this deal with Morrison's and the recent deal with Asda, that makes a massive change. You've suddenly got private equity owners. The way you have to manage your business is a different gig altogether. I'm sure I see a few smiles here. Farming, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in terms of farming. You guys all know the challenges that you're currently dealing with. In terms of hospitality, it's interesting, you're right, there were winners and losers out of COVID. You know, we saw, talking about capacity, some businesses, the capacity increases went up 80% overnight. Some businesses, the capacity went down 80% overnight. And if you were in the wrong side of that equation, you had a really difficult time to try and manage. And so there's no one size fits all, and that's something I'm going to come on to a bit second. If we talk about logistics, you know, we're talking about, it's all about disruption. I mean, I used to work in logistics. I used to deliver shampoo to various different retailers. Tesco, part of L'Oreal, and Llantrisant as it was, and it's about logistics. Is about consistency. It's about stability. It's about forecasting. It's about making sure. And every time something's random, not sure, you expect it to happen, and it doesn't happen. Even if that's a fuel system, we've got a just-in-time system that expects the vast majority of our sector is expected to be able to deliver something day one, day two in some cases. And so that's a pretty tight time schedule. And all it takes is a couple of things to break that time schedule, and then you've got a significant problem. And then I come on to the government. This is a UK-based perspective. So this is what we're saying about the UK government. I mean, one of the interesting things that's maybe where we've seen the manufacturing processing sector and the farming community come together is the Trade and Agricultural Commission. So we've got the Trade and Agricultural Commission pulled the sector together. had a conversation, put a report forward for the UK government, and the UK government have built a Trade and Agriculture Commission, which has got farmers in it, fantastic, but doesn't have any manufacturers in it. So you get to the situation where you're trying to bring people together, and then you're not. It doesn't seem to really make sense, to be honest with you. However, I think that's the sort of a global perspective, and there's loads more I could go on, but I'll try and keep you awake if I can. So finally, we've actually got to Wales, thank goodness. First things to say is that actually, as a food and drink sector, you've just heard from Leslie, we are actually really fortunate. I said to you earlier that the Food and Drink Federation is a pan-UK organisation, but the support that we get, whether it's clusters, whether it's support with individual initiatives, and also it's far superior in Wales than I've seen. I've worked in different sectors, different parts, it's far superior. The other thing is, I don't know if how many, could I just a show of hands, how many of you guys went to Blast Cymru? Okay, how many of you guys heard of Blast Cymru? Oh, that's a shocking difference, come on now. Anyway, the point is it's not a massive trade show, but it's a classic Wales scenario. It shows we are punching above our weight by some distance. The nature of the technology in there, the clusters, the innovation centres, the various different aspects, it was really quite something. And the other thing in terms of talking about Wales, again, it's been mentioned, is about reputation for high standards. But the reality is there is you guys do have concern about the flows. What do these trade deals mean? In terms of the other challenges, if we look more, you sort of highlight it in Wales, you talk about supply chains. In a rural environment, that's more difficult. It's more difficult to have the supply chain. It's more difficult to get the people. We do have an aging working population. So there's a lot of food and drink manufacturers that I talk to out there say, yes, I've got my staff. Yes, they've been with me for 25 years. But what am I going to do in 10 years' time when they're all going to retire at the same time? And so that's a real concern for them. And then the other one, which is maybe more prevalent, is the digital infrastructure aspect. In terms of other areas, maybe more from a manufacturing point of view, you talk about we are the lowest rate of productivity in the UK. We're a manufacturing nation. Well, and I just find that quite disappointing, to say the least. But the other thing that we've got is we are predominantly you use the term SME. So I'll give you an example. I used to run a business called D-Side Cereals at a turnover of £32 million. Okay, in Wales, there's roughly 1,000 food and drink manufacturers, and D-Side Cereals, in the scale of 1 to 1,000, was 20th on that list. So what that does is it gives you a scale of when we talk about SME businesses in Wales, there are some fantastic strategic partners, and some of them in this room, in terms of solid employers in Wales, but the food and drink sector has a significant amount of smaller businesses, which means it needs to think about what that means. I've intentionally, for those reading the slide rather than listen to me prattle on, I've intentionally put more opportunities on that sheet because genuinely I think they're there. And some of these are, probably everyone's known about them, but what happens is when you go through a crisis, things come up and you think, oh yeah, I didn't realise that. It was staring me in the face, I didn't realise that. First one is about, adding value. What's adding value? You've got a base product, you do something with it, you can sell it for more. And we've got an opportunity in Wales maybe to add more value to the products that we've got. There are cases, and you're starting to see that, but there are cases of, crops being harvested, sent to Swindon, stuck in a bag, sent back to Pembrokeshire, for example. These things are opportunities for Wales, and we should recognise that. And the other one that you've started to see is direct-to-consumer models. So effectively, that's, your online ordering, because without any of the shadow of doubt, that's definitely a journey we're going. I'm sure Sophie will tell you about that moving on. When I say consolidate supply chains, one thing that was mentioned earlier was about the EU exit. Effectively, the food and drink sector in Wales, vast small businesses, you have to have export health certificates for a specific load. Because of that, those deliveries and those exports effectively become uneconomic overnight. They become uneconomic for the manufacturer. They also become uneconomic for the customer. There was one case, a sample was sent that was worth £40, and then it arrives in Italy. And in Italy, they were asked to pay €125 euros just to receive it. So the challenge there is about how do we bring those, because there's economies of scale that you really need to have. Local sourcing, I think absolutely. Local sourcing is there for sure. There's definitely an opportunity. And then I talk about cross-centre partnerships, which I think is really important. this one's probably the one that's really closest to my heart. Create a perception that basically want people to work in food and drink. So, you know, you shut your eyes and you say, what does a food and drink factory look like? Do you think it's automated, it's clean, it's a great place to work? Does that what people think? Is that what the young people think, the Wales think? Or they think maybe something different? And I think it's our job as a sector to actually play a huge role in doing that. The reason I say develop science and technology is because at the moment, the vast majority of equipment that we use in Wales is actually imported. It tends to be Germany, maybe France, a bit of Turkey and China if you're really trying to get a bargain, but I wouldn't necessarily advocate that. But the point is, if we're looking to grow our manufacturing sector in Wales, why don't we actually make the equipment to allow us to manufacture in Wales? Why don't we do that? And there's opportunities. And actually, if you think about the logic of that, there's a cycle there. So we're looking for younger people, we're looking for more apprentices, we're looking for more STEM skills. Well, if you think about it, if you manufacture the equipment in Wales, you supply it to your customer in Wales, you then need the people to maintain that. Where do those people come from? You can train them as apprenticeships and you create a cycle where you've actually bring in a range of potential into Wales. And why can't we do that? Why does it have to be elsewhere? And I'll come back to my thing about net zero, but fundamentally, you know, there's a balance. One of the things is we talk a lot about sustainability, and I'll come on to at the end, but fundamentally, especially Wales, there's a lot of policies that the Welsh Government has the opportunity to make a difference with, whether it's the EPR, whether it's what we're doing with recycling. There's lots of different policies. Now, Wales is, you know, number 3 in the world in recycling. Number 1 is sustainable farming. Brilliant. Let's make sure we make the right choices to lead so that what that then means is the overall balance between what we're trying to deliver is best case. And on that net zero, I'm not going to take you through. The reason, I hope you don't mind, I've got some time. What I wanted to do sometimes is I just wanted to share with you how the manufacturing sector might perceive what you guys are doing. So this isn't necessarily any judgment. This is about saying this is what a view is, because I always think it's really important to understand how your customers potentially see you. It gives you that chance to perspective. Now this is from, I mentioned the 2040. This is from something called a net zero handbook. It's 72 pages. It's all right, don't worry, I've only got 3. But the reality of the situation is what we're trying to do is to go to the food and drink sector across as many areas as we can to give them a sense of where we see the situation as it is now. So the first one is actually, that is the percentages of, if you look along the food and drink supply chain, that is the analysis of the percentages based on 2020 figures from RAP. And it's interesting already, there's a lot of doubt about are they right, are they not right? I'm not here to justify the figures or explain to you the details. But what I would say to you is that this is the perception. So the perception, basically, you can see there, half of it is ingredients on the left-hand side. You can see there that in terms of how that looks is the scale. What's interesting for our sector, and this is why it's really going to be really important, large food and drink manufacturers, small food and drink manufacturers are all going to be saying, well, we're going to go to net zero by this time, whatever the time is. Not a single manufacturer in the food and drink sector can do it on their own. Not a single one. So what, and if you actually look at that middle section of 14% includes basically the packaging that you're receiving, your manufacturing process and the transport. So what that then means is that clearly we need to look and see how we need to reach out. We need to reach out and we need to discuss it. As I said, the figures could be right or wrong. That's not really the point. The point is this is about a call to action rather than the specifics of what these figures actually tell us. So I won't go through this in detail, but the reason I'm showing you this is you guys will all know the different topics. It's just, this is the type of information now that we're trying to get people. So it's the point about communication and education. It might not be 100%, but from an 80-20 perspective, they need to start asking some questions to understand how they can improve their supply chains. And that's the purpose of this document, just to give them some solidity and some way in terms of taking that through. Interestingly, what are the actions that are coming just in the ingredients section? And the actual net zero roadmap, I should have said earlier, has got a range of different sections. I'm just bringing ingredients for your guys' attention, really. Basically, the first one is understand. And I come on to that when I talk about reset. I bet the vast majority of people don't actually know where they are on. Where am I now? Where am I starting from? What's my platform? What's my base case? Where is it? And I think that's going to be quite interesting from simple, right, at least half, whether it's half, whether it's 45%, whether it's 53%, half are ingredients. You're going to have a look at your ingredients, Mr. Manufacturer, whatever that is. And it's some might be more and some might be less. Then, okay, you're looking at, and this is where you get to the partnership piece of it is, okay, carbon ingredients from producers. So actually start to think about, can you choose different suppliers? And this is really interesting because whether this could be part of your narrative when you're talking about how does Wales compete and how do you get recognised for the sustainability of the meat that you guys produce, is maybe there's an opportunity here to actually get in on the front foot and have proactive conversations with your customers. It's just an idea. And then the other one, which is also quite interesting, is then about how you develop the products. When you do your product development, how are you then factoring in that potential outcomes of carbon? So that's, as I say, it's just a snapshot, but it's just to give you a flavour of the type of things people might be looking at. So you'll be glad to know this is the last slide. I'm nearly there. So I started off with this that said it was reset or redefine. It's not. It's like everything else. It's reset and redefine. At the very least, but the fundamental challenge, I think, is competitive. It was interesting. I was talking to, I think it was, I talked to Dave. It was Dave earlier on, and one of the things when we talk about competitive is competitive in 2027 is probably not going to be what competitive was 2 years ago. And I think so there's almost an opportunity to define what that competitive is. Clearly, price is clearly important, but in terms of there may be other things that come onto value. So in terms of reset, I mentioned it earlier, was to say, where are we on emissions? Where are you on emissions? And this is very much about what manufacturers have to do. I think one of the things that there's definitely also a case for us to consider, it says value and resilience mapping, but it's really the Welsh food and drink supply chain. Do we really have that nailed down? Do we know what that actually is? I think in some cases we do. I think maybe there's room for us to know that better. So the type of idea I'm talking about there is, so we have a CO2 shortage, right? What happens? What's the contingency for CO2, for example? So those connected areas where we just expect it all seamlessly to work. And then suddenly, oh, hang on, what do I do about that? I've put assessment of opportunities for profitable growth. It's one of these standard phrases, really. But I think that comes down to the value added piece, comes down to you talk about your customers and listen to your customers piece. What are they looking for? Where can Wales stand differently? And for me, technology, what is technology? That's probably one of the first things is to say, right, okay, how can technology work in my business? There's a lot of content about automation, digitalizing, various different things, but actually, things like vertical farming, there's various different things that you can look at. And I think there's a case in point for us just to have a look at what does that mean for all the supply chains, to be honest with you. Okay, so redefine. I'm a big guy in terms of collaborative partnerships. That's why I'm really, really thrilled to have the opportunity to speak to you. But I think we need to start talking to people we're not used to talking to. Then we need to start having conversations that in some cases might be difficult, but you'll only get to the solutions if you actually have to have some difficult conversations. I talked to it earlier. One of the things is, advanced manufacturing. This phrase of advanced manufacturing, whoever puts food and drink in advanced manufacturing, I'll be honest with you, it's a lot more complicated to bring a live ingredient off the field in through a silo, put it in certain temperatures, mix it with water, manage it so you get some sort of cornflake. I used to make cornflakes. Because it's a simple product, it's really difficult to make. Because if you open a packet of cornflakes, you know whether that's good quality or not instantly, don't you? Because we all have a picture in our mind. But that means the control over that is really, really important. Whereas if you're assembling something, for example, so you're assembling a car, yeah, it's complicated, but you're putting bits together. And to a certain degree, which one of those is more advanced? I'd quite happily argue that food's got a case in that point. So for me, we need to change that perception. And this is why I was delighted to see, I don't know who was talking about the stuff with schools, but that's absolutely magic if you're doing that type of thing, because I'm really passionate about that. Industry's roles in attracting talent. And this is maybe something that we need to think about it from a point of view of the best way of getting someone excited, getting a young person excited and wanting to work in your sector is showing it to them. There's no point in keeping your gates locked and talking to the government and saying, come on, we need you to do more training programs. Training programs aren't the problem. It's the demand to work in the sector that's the problem. And for me, I think that's something we really need to make a difference at. And then finally, in terms of return on investment, you'll not be shocked I'm a Scottish accountant, one of the scary people in the world. I'm a bean counter in chief in my past life. But return on investment's different now. It's different for a couple of reasons. Labour shortages, you can't get the people. You've got 20% capacity you just cannot service. You buy that machine over there, it costs you 50 grand, you can deal with that capacity. Okay, the return on investment means it costs you X amount of money, fine. But that return on investment also has to consider the increased potential that you can create out of your business. And so there's things like that that we really need to look at. And the other thing about return on investment is breadth. So we're talking about environment, we're talking about sustainability, we're talking about how do you value the contribution of that. That needs to be part of the return on the investment from a wider perspective. Don't worry, I'm nearly finished. It's okay. So this is my final slide. I was hoping Leslie would be here because I was going to talk to her about this slide after. Because one of the things that I'm extremely passionate about is we talk about sustainability. Basically, I'll put this thing up now. Basically, you need environmental, social, and economic solutions for it to be sustainable. I know we're talking about, there's discussions about how farming funding moves in the future, and there's debates about, should we be focusing on environment, should we focus on these different areas? Fundamentally, the tough challenge is we need to do all of them. And we need to do all of them to a level that we lift everything. So from my point of view, that's something that is important in every topic. So sometimes when we use the term sustainability, there's a natural tendency to go, let's talk about trees and land. Hang on a minute, how are you paying for this over here? So I think it's really important that we have that as a narrative. And the reason I put the two flags there is back to my point about leadership and cooperation. Fundamentally, you know, from a food system, the more integrated, we've seen from the European Union exit, you take one of your supply chains off, things, you get more inflation, it's more difficult to do business, it's more difficult to operate, it makes your production processes more complex and you struggle with capacity. Wales can be a leader, but it needs to make sure that it aligns in some cases with what's happening in the UK. Just because it makes economic sense, it doesn't mean Wales can't be a leader, it doesn't mean Wales can't be a trailblazer and the best in class. It doesn't necessarily mean Wales has to do it differently to be the best in class. And with that, I'll finish. Thank you. Diolch. Sorry,
Well, thank you, Pete. That was excellent canter through supply chains and food for thought, no pun intended. But now then, we are, I'd like to have a couple of questions. We're 2 minutes past 5. Refreshments were at 5, so we can probably have 2 or 3 minutes at the most if there are questions. I know I have a question online. Rachel, and can we have the short questions and short answers, please, Pete? That's a deal? Yes? Because we're standing between the audience and food, so never a good idea to be late. Yeah.
Yeah,
great.
I don't want to come between that. A really quick one. Obviously, in terms of those scope 3 emissions with manufacturers, it's between 50 and 75% line with the supply chain. Bearing in mind our supply chains are quite complex and quite fragmented, how best can we engage our farmers in that process?
Microphone in. What I would say is relatively simple. It's like everything else. You start with your immediate customer. All you can do is walk on the chain. So who is your immediate customer? And I'm sure with groups like that, there's representatives on both ends of that chain in this room. And I'm sure you know HCC can play a role in helping those constructive conversations. I think it is anyway. Short. Sorry, boss.
Are there any other questions from the floor? Because I have one here very quickly online for as an accountant.
Steady.
You did say you were a bean counter, and bean counters are important. Now then, are these costs in labour and energy, are they here to stay? What would be your take on that? How many of them will stay?
Well, to be honest with you, I would say extra plastic on packaging, yes. Labour inflation, yes, because it's supply and demand. Energy, you know, to a certain degree, you could argue how political that is in terms of supply from Russia, but you think Russia going to cut us a deal anytime soon? So that's potentially yes. Are there needs to reformulate and continually reformulate your products to make them more healthy? Does that cost money? Yes, it does. And this is one of the concerns that we have for the sector, is especially when we look in a Welsh context. You know, Wales has got some really significantly deprived areas. And when you chuck that on top of some of the things that's been happening in terms of benefits and support for people who have really needed it during the pandemic, it's a very difficult time for families. To be honest, this is why I'm advocating technology, because technology can fix structural challenges in terms of inflation.
Yeah, but obviously there's time to adapt to all of these changes, but it's a journey that we must all be on, basically.
I think that's. I mean, some of this is frustrating. You know, could we have foreseen that lorry drivers was going to be a shortage? There's been a shortage in lorry drivers for nigh on a decade. Could we have looked at the conditions, the way that these people have to work, and say, oh, that's fine, that's not a problem? You know, there's things that we could have done, but fundamentally, it's Team Wales, it's Team UK, it's Team World. We just need to get together and do what we can, because ultimately the people that are going to be paying are the consumers, and we are also all consumers.
Absolutely, and that's a good note to end that session. Diolch yn fawr, Pete.